Identifying and Understanding Arguments, Module 4. Intro. Despite the wide range of different topics students have to cover, most philosophy courses will have a strong component based on arguments. In particular, a lot of students struggle with 1. Finding the arguments in a given text, 2. Working out the premises and conclusions, and 3. Understanding what the argument is trying to say. So, while the previous module focused more on reading comprehension and the student's ability to identify keywords in a given text, this module will focus more on how do I get the student to understand the structure and content of an argument. Step 1. What is an argument? Typically in philosophy, an argument is a series of steps or statements designed to persuade somebody to accept a given conclusion. Primarily, arguments tend to be divided into two main components. 1. Premises, the reason or statements that are offered as evidence. 2. Conclusion, the point or result that somebody is trying to prove. Typically, the conclusion is the goal or target that we are trying to get to, and the premises form the steps that we follow to get to that result. In formal logic, an argument is just a series of statements divided into premises and conclusion, and the premises don't necessarily have to offer reasons to believe the conclusion. By contrast, with these arguments, we are interested in the reasons that lead us to a given conclusion. Step 2. Versus explanations. Arguments can be distinguished from explanations as follows. An argument is a series of reasons offered as evidence for a conclusion. Typically, the argument is trying to convince somebody of the truth of a claim. An explanation isn't interested in whether or not a given statement is true, but is just focused on explaining why it is true. For example, heavy rainfall is unpleasant because it stops people playing sports outside. Argument. Heavy rainfall is caused by evaporation of water that then results in precipitation. Explanation. Step 3. Implication and Inference. Implications and inferences tend to be two sides of the same coin. Implying X is something the speaker will do, whereas inferring X is something the speaker wants the audience to do. Implication. Typically, implication is used to suggest something indirectly, often because it fills gaps in an argument in the absence of information. E.g., John handing Susan medicine implies that he thinks she is ill. Inference. Typically, inference is used for things that the audience has to find out, read into, or deduce. E.g., John inferred from Susan's reactions that he was mistaken. Step 4. Types of arguments. Typically, arguments are divided into two types. 1. Deductive, and 2. Non-deductive, such as inductive, analogy, abductive, and conductive arguments. Deductive arguments are black and white, incorrect or correct, and there can be no room in between. By contrast, non-deductive arguments tend to be more of a sliding scale from strong to weak, with lots of gray in between and no clear cutoff point. Step 5. Deductive arguments. Deductive arguments focus on proving the conclusion by following the logic and the premises. Typically, deductive arguments aim to show that if the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. For example, 1. All bachelors are unmarried men. 2. John isn't married. 3. So John is a bachelor. Here we can see that if the premises are true, there is no way for the conclusion to be false. Step 6. Inductive arguments. Most inductive arguments focus around repeat experiences of things that have happened so far, then making conclusions about what will likely happen again. Typically, good inductive arguments try to show that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is very likely to be true as well. For example, 1. The sun has risen every day this millennium, so 2. The sun will probably still rise tomorrow. Here then, we can see that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to be true as well. Step 7. Analogy arguments. Analogy arguments focus around drawing a likeness between things, then making conclusions about something based on their similarity. Typically, Good analogy arguments try to show that to the extent that two or more things are similar, then if something is true about the premises, it is very likely to be true about the conclusion. For example, 1. Chester likes driving. 2. Simon is a lot like Chester. 3. Therefore, Simon will probably like driving too. So, if the two people are in fact alike, the conclusion is likely to be true. Step 8. Abductive Arguments. Also known as inference to best explanation, abductive arguments focus on a fact that needs explaining, come up with the best explanation possible, and then infer that this explanation is likely true. Typically, good abductive arguments try to show that to the extent that the explanation in the premises is the best one we have available, then the conclusion is very likely to be true. For example, 1. We don't know why 10 people didn't come to work today. 2. The best explanation is the freak snowstorm outside. 3. Therefore, it is likely that the freak snowstorm caused the absentees. So, if the premises are the best explanation we have available, then the conclusion is likely to be true. Step 9. Conductive Arguments. Conductive arguments are based around having several premises that all independently link to the conclusion. Because they each independently lead to the conclusion, while removing a given premise weakens the overall argument, it doesn't destroy the inherent logic involved for each individual premise. For example, 1. The restaurant is reasonably priced. 2. The restaurant is conveniently located 5 minutes away. 3. The restaurant has really tasty food. 4. The restaurant has a great atmosphere. 5. Therefore, we should go to the restaurant I'm suggesting. As you can see here, while removing each premise does in fact weaken the argument by removing a reason to go, the argument is not dependent on each component part. Step 10. A priori versus a posteriori. A priori essentially means before or prior to experience. A priori arguments are things you can know or find the truth about without having to get any experience or evidence from the outside world. This includes a lot of math and logic, where we focus on reasoning, e.g., 17 plus 4 equals 21. Once somebody understands the basic concepts involved in math, they can understand the truth of this statement without having to check things in the world. These kinds of statements are often the basis for deductive arguments. A posteriori essentially means after experience. To find out the truth of an a posteriori statement, we have to check things out in the world or get experience to know if they are true. E.g., the dining room has 20 books on the shelves. Even after understanding what books, or 20, are, we still need to check the dining room to see if that is true. These kinds of statements are often used for non-deductive arguments. Step 11. Necessary conditions. If we say that x is a necessary condition for y, we mean that without x, we would not have y. We need x for y to happen. This means that something is needed for something else to be the case. Note, this does not, however, mean that having x will guarantee y, as other conditions might need to be met as well. E.g., having water is a necessary condition for plants to grow, but just having water doesn't mean plants will grow. They need sunlight too. Try to think of necessary conditions as the things you need, but they might not be the only things you need. Step 12. Sufficient conditions. If, however, we say that x is a sufficient condition for y, then having x means that y will follow. This means that having something will guarantee that the other thing will be the case. E.g., rain falling from the sky is a sufficient condition for the exposed ground to be wet. Note that sufficient conditions do not have to also be necessary conditions. E.g., it isn't necessary to have rain falling from the sky for the exposed ground to be wet. The area could have flooded, for example. But if it does rain, that is sufficient for the ground to be wet. Try to think of sufficient conditions as things that guarantee a certain thing will be the case, but that does not make them the only way to obtain that result. Step 13. Assumptions. An assumption is a statement or phrase in an argument that forms one of the premises but is unproven or unsupported by the evidence. The important thing to understand as the reader is which statements need proving or evidence and which do not. Generally, things that are widely accepted as being true might not require supporting evidence within the confines of the argument. Typically, assumptions are easiest to find when the argument is fully mapped out or understood. Sometimes, what appeared to be an assumption earlier can be justified later in a given piece of text. For example, 1. All the beautiful women here are very intelligent and we should listen to them is an assumption. It needs evidence to prove that this is true. But 2. Gravity is the best explanation for understanding how planets move through space is not an assumption and is widely known to be true. Note that 1 would no longer be an assumption if the author clarified the context, e.g., talking about a particular group of beautiful and intelligent women. Step 14. Finding the arguments in a text. Not all arguments are already laid out for you. Frequently, students will have to work to identify the arguments themselves in a given text. Most of the strategies for finding certain keywords and understanding the reading material are outlined in Module 3, but for now, we need to focus on how we understand the different types of arguments, properly identify them, and map out all the steps. When reading through a given section of reading, you will want to answer the following questions. 1. What are the premises and conclusion? What is the argument? 2. Are there any parts of the text that are explanations? 3. Are there any implications in the argument or anything we can infer? 4. Is it deductive or non-deductive? If non-deductive, what type? And 5. Are there any assumptions we need to consider? Step 15. Sample text. I think it is deplorable that people have to live in these conditions. Time and time again, we have seen that people need money to survive, as money can be used for buying clothes, food, or shelter. But people need more than just money in their pockets now. They need the means to provide themselves with earnings in the future. Jobs are one way in which we can do this. A job is where people will pay you to do a certain amount of work over a given period of time. Therefore, having jobs won't just give them the money they need to survive today, but the ability to provide for themselves tomorrow. Here we can see the various features of an argument. The writing in pink shows that the argument type is inductive. The section in the lighter color green shows an explanation. The section in yellow shows an inference, that clothes, food, and shelter help survival. The section in lime green shows the assumption at the beginning of the argument. The premises are clearly highlighted in sky blue, purple, and pink. Finally, you can see the conclusion highlighted in red. Step 16. Sub-arguments. Sometimes a text will have more than one clear argument within it, and you will have to work out how that fits into the overall conclusion. With sub-arguments, their conclusion will be used as a premise in another argument. So, if we need to resolve something else fully in order for the main argument to work, then we will label it a sub-argument and map it out first. E.g., in red, you can see the sub-argument. 1. My dog needs regular exercise for me to be a good owner. 2. My dog will get exercise regularly unless I am lazy. 3. I am not lazy. 4. My dog will get exercise regularly. 5. I am a good owner. Step 17. Tangents. If, however, a point is being made that has nothing to do with the premises or conclusion of the main point, we will consider it a tangent and try to ignore it when trying to understand our primary argument. This is often the case with more rambling passages, or something within the confines of a bigger work that maybe only becomes meaningful later on. E.g., in red we can see a tangent. 1. Plants need water to grow. 2. There is water outdoors. 3. Plants look pretty. 4. Plants grow well outdoors. Step 18. Argument Mapping 1. Sometimes, instructors will require or recommend that students map out an argument in order to understand its structure. Generally speaking, this is a fairly simple process. Lay out the premises and conclusions, with arrows connecting between them into a chain. E.g., premise 1, all fish can swim. Premise 2, Bob is a fish. Conclusion, Bob can swim. However, with multiple steps, be careful about which pieces you need together to lead on to the next step. Some will independently lead to the next step, while others only lead to the next step in combination. For example, with the two diagrams on the right, we can see with the first how the premise 1 and premise 2 independently lead to the conclusion, so we draw separate arrows for each. However, with the second, we need premise 1 and premise 2 together to get to the conclusion, so we draw one arrow between them to lead on to the next step. Step 19. Argument Mapping 2. Some arguments will have multiple steps that lead sequentially into each other before reaching the conclusion. E.g., premise 1, my friend's car broke down. Premise 2, my friend cannot go to work. Premise 3, nobody can cover his shift. Conclusion, nobody will be working on the desk that day. Sub-arguments will generally have their own branch, leading to the conclusion or later in the chain. Tangents will generally branch off and not lead to the conclusion at all. E.g., premise 1, I'm having a party tomorrow. Premise 2, it'll be a good party if Dave doesn't come. Premise 3, Dave isn't coming to the party. Sub-premise 1, either Dave will go to the party or he is out of town. Sub-premise 2, Dave is out of town. Tangent 1, Dave went to San Diego. Conclusion, it will be a good party tomorrow. Step 20. Conclusion. This completes Module 4. Please feel free to revisit any slides within this module and take any notes you need. There will be a quiz to assess your knowledge of the material within this training module, so see the relevant link in Canvas. After taking the quiz, remember to check your answers and retake the assessment if needed. A score of 100% is required. See the relevant Module 4 discussion thread as needed for this topic in Canvas for any further questions or comments.